Hi there. There's been a request for an explanation of the last question on the homework, so I'm going to try to give you a little better picture of what's going on here. Okay, on the last problem on the homework, I've got this keypad right here with 4 buttons on it, a dollar, a number, an @ mark, and an ampersand. Okay, and underneath the keypad, so that's just the buttons that you push, there are 2 wires going from up to down, that's the red, and then there's 2 wires going left to right, those are the green dotted wires. Okay, up and down are called column 1, column 2. The wires across are row 1 and row 2. And those resistors right there, I haven't explained them to everyone in the class, some people have asked. Those are resistors that put a default value onto a wire. So when nothing's connected to that wire right there is basically connected to ground. When a value is put on the wire, as long as those resistors are big, then whatever that new value that's put on that wire, it will show up on row 1. It'll show up on that wire. Okay. So when there's nothing connected to the wire, that wire by default is ground. If a different value is put onto the wire, like physically connected to a wire that has VDD or 5 volts or whatever it might be, then that wire goes to that new voltage. Okay, so let's look at a simple example here. So let's say this is your up and down wire and this is your cross wire. What happens with the button is those two make contact. Okay, so actually I should say, since that's the input to your circuit, that's sitting there, and so when somebody pushes a button, this right here, by default, it's ground. But let's say this up and down wire, let's say that had 5 volts on it, and if you make contact, now this wire right here is going to go to 5 volts. Okay, so 0 volts, 5 volts. Okay, so that's the simplest case. In your question, though, you have a little more complicated case. Let's go with 2 rows and 1 column now. So let's say I put, let's say there's 5 volts on this wire right here, and when you push the top button, it's going to make contact with this row, this top row. Okay, so let's say there's 5 volts on this. If the button gets pushed such that it's hard to get out of the way of the light, so that it touches this top wire but not the bottom wire, this top wire will go to 1. I can't get out of the light. If it goes like this, the top wire will go to light, but since it's not making contact with this wire, that wire will stay at 0. And now you can tell. So again, if we have a situation like this with 2 buttons, 1 button here and 1 button here, and you put 5 volts on this wire, if somebody pushes that top button, it'll make contact with this wire. That wire will go to 5 volts. This wire will stay at 0 volts. Okay, and then if somebody pushes the bottom button, now this wire will contact this wire. This wire will go to 5 volts. That one will stay at 0 volts. So that way you can tell between the two buttons. Okay, so 5 volts on this, by default 0. If that button gets pushed, now you've got 5 volts on that wire across. Okay, now we go to the more complex picture, and this is where I was having trouble in class because I don't have 3 arms. Okay, what you have for this problem, let's actually switch it around. Let's put 1 row wire now, and since I don't have enough hands, what's actually going to be these columns right here, those are actually the ones that are going to get pushed and make contact with the row. But since I can't hold that many things, let's kind of flip the keypad over. These are still these up and down wires are still the things that are getting pushed. And here's our input to our circuit. Now, let's say I put 5 volts on here and 5 volts on here. So both of these wires have 5 volts on them. And here's my wire going across. And let's say I push the button over here. So that means this makes contact with your row wire. Now your row wire has 1 on it. The problem is, because you had 5 volts on both of these up and down columns, you can't tell whether it was this button that got pushed or this button that got pushed. Okay, so if you put 5 volts on both wires, and then this one is the one making contact, if you just look at this wire, you say, oh, it went high, but because both of these columns had 5 volts on it, you can't tell whether it was this or whether it was this. You can't tell which button's being pushed. Okay, so what happens is the way that these circuits work is that first you put 5 volts on this wire and 0 volts on that wire, and then you go and see what value is on this cross wire, on the row wire. Okay, if it's 0, then you go back, you put 0 volts on this wire and 5 volts on that wire, and again you go and you look at the value on the row wire and see if it's high or low. And you keep going back and forth. Put a 1 on this wire, check the row value, put a 5 volt on this and 0 volt on that, check the row wire, then put 0 volts here and 5 volts here and check the row wire. And you keep doing that until you see the row wire go high. But now, because you know that you set this one high, and if you see the row wire go high, that means that this button has been pushed. Okay, so if this is 1 and this is 0, or 5 volts and 0 volts, and you look at the row wire and you see a high voltage on the row wire, you know that this button has been pushed, not this one. Okay, your problem is even more complicated than that. Instead of just setting this one high and seeing if the row wire went high, and then setting this one high and seeing if the row wire went high, and then setting this one high and seeing if the row wire went high, and then seeing if this one went high, and setting this one high and seeing if the row wire went high. Now you have 2 cases here. So what you have to do in this case is you set this wire high, then check this row, then check this row, then set this wire low, set this wire to high, and then check that wire, and then check that wire. Then you set this one to 0 and set this one high, and then check that wire and that wire until a row goes high. And that's the only way you can triangulate and see whether it's this button, this button, this button, or this button that's been pushed. Oakley, shh. Okay, I think we're going to have a barking fit. I'll leave it at that. And I'll be on Skype. Oakley, shh. I'll be on Skype tomorrow night.